The sheriff and his posse came in the middle of the night. They were looking for 3 black former slaves who had built a thriving business together in their new rural community. The posse seized the men and transported them to a jail cell in a city about 30 miles away. They were soon hauled into court where a judge declared them fugitive slaves and ordered them returned to their master under the Fugitive Slave Act. It was May 31st, 1852. The 3 men, Carter and Robert Perkins and Sandy Jones, had been living in Placer County and were taken to jail and court in Sacramento, the future capital of California, a state that had been admitted to the Union in 1850 as a free state 2 years earlier, and whose very constitution explicitly prohibited slavery. Despite being outlawed, slavery would persist for more than a decade after California's statehood, and the case of these 3 men, spirited away from their home in Placer County to the Sacramento jail, helped perpetuate it. The story of slavery's persistence in California began on September 1st, 1849, in Monterey, where 48 delegates gathered to draft a state constitution to be presented to Congress as California applied for statehood. They agreed on a central principle: neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, unless for the punishment of crimes, shall ever be tolerated in this state. This opposition to slavery was rooted in part in economics. Whites didn't like the idea of competing with unpaid slave labor for jobs, which they felt could drag down white wages. Some wanted to go a step further and keep blacks out of California altogether. Sacramento delegate Morton McCarver, a Southern transplant, proposed an amendment to the slavery clause that would forbid blacks from entering the state at all, whether they were free or brought in by slaveholders. The delegates, many of whom were also from the South, approved McCarver's proposal. But days later, they changed their minds and removed the amendment after realizing it could jeopardize California's chances for statehood. Nearly a year later, in 1850, Congress accepted California into the Union as the 31st state. At the time of statehood, blacks were a tiny slice of California's total population of 92,957. The 1850 census counted 962 free colored people in California, with 212 in Sacramento County. There were 203 black slaves in California and 16 in Sacramento County. On April 15, 1852, California passed the Fugitive Slave Act, which mirrored federal legislation passed 2 years earlier. The law, which affected slaves brought into California prior to statehood, said an owner is hereby empowered to seize or arrest an enslaved person who had escaped. This is the law that convicted the Perkins brothers and Sandy Jones. The 3 were brought to the Sacramento area in 1849 as slaves from Mississippi by their owner, a man named C.S. Perkins. Before returning to Mississippi, Perkins apparently freed the men in the fall of 1851, and they went into business, hauling goods in and around the gold fields near Auburn. The 3 had done well for themselves, amassing $3,200, more than $120,000 in 2023 dollars.
They were probably trying to raise enough money to buy their family members who they'd been forced to leave behind in Mississippi. And that's actually something that we kind of forget, is that we think, yes, California was a place where people could work toward their freedom. But in doing that, they were separated, perhaps permanently, from their family members by thousands of miles.
But in early 1852, Perkins wanted the slaves back and dispatched his son Charles to find them. Accompanied by the Placer County Sheriff and several other men, the younger Perkins had the trio arrested in the middle of the night in the small community of Ophir, near Auburn.
Basically broke in, chained up the men, put them in their own cart, and transported them with their own team of mules to the city of Sacramento. And they did this in the dead of night, and according to some accountants, did it that way because they knew that people in the local community would try to defend the men if they did it out in the open in broad daylight.
After arriving in Sacramento, they were brought before the court in what became one of the first tests of the state's new fugitive slave law.
Green Perkins produces a letter from Charles Perkins back in Mississippi, the original man who had gone to California. This letter gives Green Perkins essentially power of attorney, which just means like legal authority, legal power to have the men arrested, to bring them before a justice of the peace, which he was entitled to do under California's new Fugitive Slave Act, and to say, hey, these men are property. They are bound to labor in the state of Mississippi, and they need to be returned. And so that is what Green Perkins did.
Defending them was noted anti-slavery lawyer Cornelius Cole, who was brought into the case at the urging of future railroad baron Mark Hopkins.
Cornelius Cole had worked already on some other slave cases in California, and he was adamant that California's constitution supposed to be a free constitution, a free soil constitution that banned slavery, and that the arrest of these men and the 1852 California Fugitive Slave Law were unconstitutional.
But Cole was threatened with violence during the trial, and the judge ultimately ordered the 3 men turned over to their former owner.
Cole later described that the court was full of pro-slavery Southerners, that some of them had guns with them, that they were packing guns in the court. Cole essentially concluded that the judge in the case, Aldrich, was intimidated into sending the men back to slavery.
Sacramento's newspapers paid little attention to the case. Although the Union reported, the decision of the court gives very general satisfaction to the community. The men took the case to the California Supreme Court, arguing that the Fugitive Slave Law violated the Constitution's ban on slavery. The court's justices disagreed, saying the ban on slavery was the declaration of a principle and did not protect them. They were simply property, and California's laws couldn't obstruct the rights of an owner to reclaim his slaves.
But the contradictory thing about that particular slave case was those particular individuals were freed and then re-enslaved by the masters that they were negotiating with, and they actually made money for the masters and everything, and basically bought their freedom, and were actually businessmen. But through some tricks of the law and through some sympathies they received from the judiciary at that time, which was very much pro-slavery because of Southern Democrats, that worked against them in that favor.
The 3 men were returned to Mississippi.
The story is that at least one of the men, and maybe all 3, managed to escape from Green Perkins when they landed in Panama, but we just don't know.
In November 1855, the Colored Methodist Church in Sacramento hosted the first state convention of the colored citizens of the state of California. The 2-day meeting concluded with delegates passing a series of resolutions, including one demanding the legislature repeal a pair of 1851 laws forbidding blacks from testifying in court. The legislature ignored them, but blacks in Sacramento were beginning to find their voice. It would come in handy soon.
We have evidence that African American Californians were very aware of their new rights. They had helped essentially give themselves those rights by forcing the state legislature to act in the name of liberty and legal equality. And they were going to exercise those rights whenever possible to defend the freedom of the vulnerable members of their community.